Hi, everyone. I'm Diane Brady. I'm here with my colleague, Rob LaFranco, Assistant Managing Editor on the Wealth Team, and we are talking, Rob, about the Africa Wealth List. Tell me a bit about what some of the shifts were this year, and hello.
Hi, Diane. It's great to be here. Great to talk about this. Yeah, this is it's a tough region to tackle. It's not as transparent as some of the other regions that we do cover. That said, there are a lot of public fortunes out there and a lot of private companies that actually do make their financials public or have to publicly release some financials. So, this year's list, and it's true for the Africa list going many years back. There is a set number of names, and it doesn't really seem to change. It's not the region where you see the kind of fortunes created, say, in the United States tech industry, where suddenly somebody like a Sam Bankman-Fried can become worth $6 billion or 16, and then suddenly worth. It's not that kind of dynamism.
Right.
There's very entrenched legacy fortunes there. And that was the case this year. Last year, they had jumped quite a bit on the 2022 lists, which covered calendar 2021 for the most part, and that was because markets were surging. This year, markets plummeted, and although they did have a bit of a rally towards the latter part of the year, the fortunes are down to single digits.
Rob, you mentioned that these are a lot of legacy players. Where do they amass most of their wealth?
We do see common themes. Commodities for sure. Cement is a big fortune creator for a couple of the billionaires. Telecommunications. Obviously, this is a region where banking is not as fully developed as it is in the more developed markets, and so people are banking on their phones and relying on their phones for internet access, that sort of thing. So telecoms, there's quite a number of billionaires on there with investments in telecom or whose fortunes are essentially all from telecom.
Mm-hmm.
Retail is a big one. There's two fortunes created that are big in retail, and then there's industrial fortunes. Someone like Issad Rabrab in Algeria, whose company is essentially the economy of Algeria and is in many industrial sectors.
You mentioned there are 19 billionaires. Is that correct on this year's list?
There are 19 this year. There were 18 last year, and that was the biggest surprise in what, numerically is kind of a ho-hum list. The ranking is about the same. The fortunes are down 3% or so from last year. So not much change, but there was a kind of a surprising return from a retailer out of South Africa, Dr. Christo Bisa. He was a staple on the list up until 2018, when he lost his fortune, and there was a scandal regarding a company called Steinhoff International with some accounting irregularities, as were found. Now, he was not, as far as we know, responsible for those accounting irregularities, but he was chairman of Steinhoff at the time and became chairman by selling his bargain retailer called Pepcor to Steinhoff for almost $6 billion in 2015. He then doubled down, borrowed some money, purchased more shares in Steinhoff as chairman, and then he lost almost all of his fortune when that company got
He's
enraptured in
back.
this.
That's impressive that he's back.
Well, he sued,
Mm-hmm.
complaining that this was not fair, and they kind of pulled a fast one on him, and that suit dragged on for years. It was settled in March of 2022. He received a couple of $100 million in cash. It was 7 billion rand. South African rand was the total settlement, and it included 5% of the company, that Pepcor, that he sold to them, that he once owned all of. He got 5% of that back in the settlement.
So, Rob, you mentioned South Africa. When we think about the region, there are certain pockets of economic activity. Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana. Is that where we're seeing the billionaires being created as well?
The billionaires are heavily concentrated in three main markets: South Africa, Nigeria, and Egypt. And that's been consistent for many years on the list. We do have a billionaire from Morocco, who also happens to be the prime minister of Morocco. We have a billionaire from Tanzania. So there are sporadic billionaires that pop up from different places, but the main forces of economic growth are in Nigeria, Egypt, and South Africa. Nigeria is very interesting. I mean, there you have the richest person in Africa, Aliko Dangote, who has been the richest person 12 years running now. He's got a fortune in cement. That's his biggest. It's about $8 billion, his stake in the cement company, salt, sugar. He's just put online in March, long awaited. It was a partnership with the government, a fertilizer company that's just online and starting operations, and now a refinery is set to come in. So there's a guy who, his fortune is so entrenched with the government that he is an essential part of any government's economic plan. It kind of comes back to Aliko Dangote. Mike Adenuga is another one who has a fortune like that, also in Nigeria. So that's very particular to Nigeria. In Egypt, you have the Sawiris family, who Onsi Sawiri, who passed away a couple of years ago. He has 3 sons, and they each sort of carved up his empire a little bit. And that's an industrial empire with fingers in a bunch of different pies. And in South Africa, you have the retail fortune of Christo Wiese that we were talking about. That's there are 2 big retail fortunes that have come out of South Africa. One is Wiese's, who is now back. The other is a guy named Nady Kirsch, who is not on this list because he essentially lives in London. It's his residence. That's where his business is. And his main asset is actually in the US. He had a very similar situation. And this is a theme that echoes in African wealth, is it can be created and sustained with government help, or, with your fingers into many pies, as is the case with Issa Rabrab in Algeria. He essentially is the backbone of the Algerian economy. You could probably say the same, less percentage-wise, for Aliko Dangote. But then you have fortunes like Wiese and Nady Kirsch, both of whom were cash and carry, bargain hunter, retailer type fortunes, created and through partnerships that went awry, lost, and then recreated. Both of them have a very similar scenario. Also out of South Africa, you have fortunes like Nicky Oppenheimer's, which is the old De Beers diamond fortune. And these are legacy fortunes that go way back to the colonial times, but still resides in a close number of hands.
You raise an interesting point about where this wealth is created and where these billionaires reside. We've certainly seen in cases like Russia, for example, we've seen a number of billionaires that live outside of the country. Is that the case in Africa? Because I know there's been a lot of interest in the continent. People talk about, 1 billion plus consumers, but yet we're seeing a relatively small number of billionaires relative to other parts of the world. Is that because the fortunes are being made by people based elsewhere?
No, it's actually, it's different if you were to compare it to, say, let's compare it to the Russian fortunes. The Russians created, many of the who we call the oligarchs, created their fortunes in the breakdown of the Soviet Union. Most of them have their tentacles are very deep into the West, and they have offshore companies, and they live in places like Paris or London, and with offices in Cyprus. And so their focus is to move their wealth out of the reaches of the government. In Africa, you see a different scenario where most of these people are living and residing, aside from Nady Kirsch, who I mentioned, in their home countries.
So investing in their countries.
Yes, and there is a lot of money poured into Africa from countries like China and Europe, regions like Europe, the United States, all of whom are trying to develop because they see it as a very rich market. The telecom fortunes are a testament to that. These are people who kind of leapfrogged past the wired telephone business and leapfrogged past going to a bank teller, and they do everything on their cell phones. So that's a massive business. And so you see, I think out of all of the fortunes on our list, of this particular list, they are all residing in the countries that they are from, including the Sawiris families in Egypt, including Issa Rabrab, who has he's got a lot of business activities in Europe, but he resides in Algeria and is very close to the Algerian government.
I think one thing people underappreciate is the fact that the wealth list is usually investigative journalism, very much so, in fact, because most of the wealthy don't like to have their wealth chronicled. You mentioned at the start of this conversation that this is a more challenging region. Is that primarily because of many of these companies are not publicly listed, or are there other factors that make it challenging to truly get your arms around the wealth?
It's a combination of things. I mean, it is investigative, and fortunately, there are companies like Vodafone and Orange, European companies who invest alongside many of these African entrepreneurs, and they have to disclose certain information about the business activities they have. So you can glean certain amount of information from that, apply it to these companies, so you can estimate what a revenue picture looks like for, say, a telecommunications company operating out of Morocco, and possibly even what net profits might look like. So that's something where you can get a reasonable guess on a private company and what the size of that company is, what its impact is in the market, and what its value would be. But then you have other situations, one like Issa Rabrab in Algeria, who has a revenue figure that was first published on the company website in 2014 and has not changed. This company has had $5 billion in revenue, as far as the world knows, for the last 10 years or so. Now, we know that's
The
not
kind of
true.
consistency GE used to have every quarter. To a penny. If we step back to the 30,000-foot view, I want to, we're talking about billionaires. Last year, Forbes also did its 30 under 30 summit in Botswana that was very successful, about young African entrepreneurs. And I want to capture, to some extent, does this give us any indication of the amount of entrepreneurial energy and economic development going on? Because billionaires are, of course, the tippy top, and we don't want to use that as a surrogate for economic activity.
Yeah, I mean, there is, of course, it's a dynamic region, and no matter where you go, there's, and there's development to be done and fortunes to be made. And you need a local partner. You're not going to be a $300 million investment fund from London going into Lagos and kind of know the landscape. One of the billionaires, I sat with his people last week, and they were walking me through some of this. Some of their assets are publicly traded, and they were bringing up the point, there's one billionaire on the list who basically controls, last year it was 95%, this year it's 98% of two publicly traded companies. Now, when you have a float that's that small, our suspicions, of course, are raised. So we have to find a way to discount that, because it's not whatever its public value is. And it's also companies, they
That
throw off hundreds of.
2% only tells you so much.
Correct. And the perspective of these representatives for this billionaire were, basically, you can, for a certain amount of money, get a listing for any company on one of these local exchanges who don't have the same kind of rules that, say, the New York Stock Exchange has, or the London Stock Exchange. And that may not actually be your money. You can have all sorts of cronies and cohorts that you make these handshake agreements on, and you can prop up a price when you control 98% of a company. So that makes it very difficult on the public side to basically say, well, okay, the numbers say the fortune is this, but you have to discount that to a certain extent so you can make it apples to apples. You compare that to a situation like Issa Rabrab's company, Zevital in Algeria. There, you know that it's a massive company. You know that it has a deep impact on the Algerian economy and elsewhere, because it does operate in Europe, and there are plenty of paper trails of that happening. You just have to find some effective way to say, okay, what has the revenue for that company done since 2014, and keep a sort of year-over-year record of that, using the news and activities and its own announcements to try and back out what that revenue picture might look like today. So it's a challenging enterprise, but it's very clear, and we've been contacted. It's a region where the entrepreneurs and the billionaires are very vocal, and they want to participate. In part, maybe for ego, in part, it may be for legitimacy, in part, it may be to attract more capital so they can build their fortunes, or perhaps they're even thinking altruistically to do great things for the African people. So it's a very vocal group of people, including some entrepreneurs who want to be considered billionaires, who talk us through their telecom investments and all sorts of apps that they have. Not all that we believe, but there is a dynamic spirit in Africa. There's a lot of capitalism happening there.
No, I believe it. And having lived there earlier in my career, I know there's a lot of national pride, too, in these countries. So I hope everybody checks out the list, Rob, and thanks for joining us.
Great to be here.